There are things out there in the woods at night that we, as humans, should not disturb. This is my first time publicly telling this story. It almost sounds like the generic monster in the woods story, but I've been holding on to it for a few years now, and I'm finally ready to tell it. I live in the hill country of Texas, and this event happened back in August of 2018. I promise you, it's true. As anyone in Texas can tell you, August is very hot. The summer is what I like to call Diet August. And for good reason. I worked as a maintenance tech for a school district, so the heat and manual labor were my best friends. One of my buddies called me one day around lunchtime, and he told me there was a problem at his family's ranch. Apparently, one of the horses had gotten loose and ran off the evening before and hadn't returned. So he asked me if I could help look for it. It was Friday, and I didn't have any plans, so a trip to the ranch sounded like a great way to spend the weekend. A few hours later, I got another call. This time, I was told they found the horse, but it was dead, and that now we would go hunting for whatever killed this horse. For those that don't know, there aren't that many apex around here. Plenty of coyotes and wild pigs, and very rare, a mountain lion. But that's about it, unless someone has some exotic stuff on their land. One time, I saw a zebra chilling under a tree while driving down some back road. When I got off work, I went home and got changed into some hunting clothes and prepped my gear. At the time, I had an SKS, which actually worked fine. Ammo was very cheap. I assumed that we would need some quick follow-up shots, so I know it would do the job. With a big sharp knife to hang on my belt, I felt ready for whatever would happen. My friend picked me up, and we drove for about 2 hours before we finally arrived at his family's ranch. The ranch was beautiful, thick forest, rolling hills, and a lot of wildlife. The basic layout was the main house situated down a dirt road that took several minutes to navigate, so it was set pretty far from any roads. About 100 yards from the house was the barn where most of the equipment was kept, a couple of ATVs, and a cool little side-by-side that was always a blast to drive. There was a field where the horses were kept, but aside from that, the area was just wild land. Trails had been cut so many times that they formed very reliable means of exploring. When we got out of the car and got my stuff unloaded, I was told we were waiting on a couple more people to show up. Fine by me, the more the merrier. In the meantime, I was told to go to the barn and see what was left of the horse that had been retrieved from the forest. The scene that I saw was not something I expected, even though I really didn't know what I was expecting to see. It was torn to ribbons. Deep slash marks covered the body. The stomach was torn open, and I could see tooth marks where something had taken bites, but it didn't seem like it had been fed on, more like demolished in a fit of rage. That ruled out coyotes instantly. If a pack was strong enough to take this horse down, they would have done their best to pick it clean. It also couldn't have been pigs. There were no signs of injury on the lower legs. That left us with some maniac roaming the woods, or a mountain lion. The lion, rare as they might be, looked like the culprit. It actually broke my heart, thinking that we would have to kill it. To be honest, I would rather find a way to remove it and take it somewhere safe. But if it's taking down horses, it would have no problem taking down a human. The sun was slowly getting lower in the sky when the other guys showed up. I won't use their names, of course, but there were 4 of us. We discussed options for something and decided that a grid search using maps of the ranch would be our best bet. However, with so much land to cover, we would each take an area to sweep. Every 10 minutes, we would have a radio check to make sure we were safe. One of my favorite things about coming here was that there was some pretty awesome stuff we could use for our shenanigans. Tonight, we would have sets of night vision goggles. I chose the one with the head mount, so I could have one eye available to see normal. One thing about using night vision is the lack of depth perception, and I'm not keen on tripping over every bump on the ground. We chose our grid to search, checked our gear, tested the radios, and off we went. By our third radio check, I was finally in place to start looking. I took out the map, used my compass to situate myself, and picked the direction to walk. The sun was real low by now, and was already near pitch black under the canopy of oak and cedar trees. With the night vision over my eye, I was creeping through the brush, trying my best to make as little noise as possible. From the sound of it, I was the only creature being quiet. The forest was teeming with all the critters beginning their nightly activities. Raccoons, possums, cottontails, and jackrabbits. Of course, you can't forget about the bugs. The constant chattering of cicadas, mixed with crickets and whatever else is out there, made noise that gave the area an almost deafening feeling. Slowly I scanned the area with the night vision, rifle in the low ready position. 2 radio checks went by, when I suddenly realized that the woods had gone quiet. Standing alone at night in a forest that no longer has any noise is a scary thing. Generally, animals will go quiet when danger is nearby. The problem was, nothing seemed to care about my presence, and now there was dead silence. I made my way to a clearing and found a tall hill. It looked like a good point to get my bearings, so I climbed a fairly steep slope. At the top, I had as close to a commanding view as one could hope when surrounded by tall trees. In any way, I was about maybe 20 to 25 yards from the tree line. The sun was down, with the last glimmer of purple and red sinking below the horizon. Navigating was about to get a bit more difficult. Using the night vision, I tried to pick out any landmark I could see to figure out where I was on the map. Swinging my head around, I caught a reflection of eyes in the trees. They were big and bright and unblinking. I stared for a moment, deciding what I should do. I could see pretty well in the clearing, thanks to the moonlight, but in the tree line was pitch blackness. I called out to the eyes, trying to get whatever it was to move so I could see it better. I could tell it was taller than a deer, or basically anything else that lived there. So I thought it was a person. Suddenly, I was really wishing it was a mountain lion. A horse mutilating cycle was not what I wanted on my hunting bingo card. I called out and said, "Hey, this is private land. You need to leave right now." Nothing happened for maybe 30 seconds when I heard the eye speak. It said, "Leave right now," in a perfect impression of my voice, as though it was recording. Safe to say, that was extremely unsettling. I raised my rifle and said, "If you don't leave right now, you're gonna die." As soon as I said that, the eyes lifted as though they had stood up. The height from my best guess was maybe 7 to 8 feet, depending on how tall the tree next to it was. Then, it moved, stepping out of the darkness and into view of my night vision. It repeated my words again, saying, "If you don't leave right now, you're gonna die." For a moment, I was in shock. This thing looked sickly white, maybe gray. It had a long and slender frame. Without a second thought, I pulled the trigger and fired. How I ended up missing at this distance was a mystery to me. But I fired again, and this time the bullet struck home. The creature let out this monstrous, unnatural wail like a mountain lion scream, mixed with what sounded like an air horn. I was stunned. nearly paralyzed with the most primal sense of fear I have ever experienced. Then it took a step towards me. I fired again, and again, and again, emptying my entire magazine of 20 rounds, but it still kept walking. If I hit it, I didn't know because it hadn't screamed again. Without taking my eye off of it with the night vision, I fumbled to eject the magazine and was reaching for another when it stopped walking maybe a yard from me. The creature stood there, staring at me. It didn't have any hair, and its skin looked as though it was merely wrapped tightly around bone with no muscle or definition. The eyes were small. Despite having a massive reflection in the IR, there was a line that I guess was most likely the mouth. I stood there, not knowing what to do. It raised its hand towards me, and then I saw the fingers. There were 4 fingers, long and black, tapering down to something like an ice pick. That's when the smell hit me. It was like hot vomit, with the odor of decay and feces. In my brain, I knew I had to get away from it, but I physically couldn't move. Just before the fingers made contact with my shoulder, there was this moment of clarity and I was able to move. With a fluid motion, I dropped my rifle from my hands, falling across my chest and being caught by the sling, and with my right hand I drew out the knife. I slashed upward. I ended up slashing up from the creature's right hip towards the left shoulder. It screamed and took a step back. This was my moment to run. I stepped backwards and fell down the side of the hill, rolling as I tried to not drop the knife and keep my rifle from being too damaged. At the bottom, I rolled to my feet and took off in a flat sprint, crashing through the brush like a train. I could hear heavy steps behind me. I knew if I looked back, I would most likely die. So I just kept running and trying to avoid hitting a random branch as they briefly came into view in the night vision, which had somehow stayed on my head. I'm not the strongest runner, but fear and adrenaline are excellent motivators. I came out of the forest and directly into the other 3 guys as they were on their way to me. They started yelling and asking what happened as I screamed, "Just fire away," as I tried to recover. They took my word for it and began shooting into the trees, emptying their mags on their 2 AR-15s and 1 AR-10. As their rifles became empty, they helped pick me up from the ground, and we started running down the trail and back towards the house. After what felt like forever running, we flew into the house and locked the door. We kept shifting our eyes to each other and out the nearest window. Once we felt like we had the air to talk, I explained what happened. They told me they heard the shots and started heading towards my direction, thinking I had found a mountain lion or somehow got injured, trying to signal for help. It was then that I realized I had likely dropped the radio when I fell down the hill, because they said they tried getting me on their radios, but I hadn't answered. It was only after I finished talking that my friend, whose family owns the ranch, said that they had heard strange things before, but never tried to investigate. None of us got any sleep that night, keeping watch out the 4 sides of the house with rifles loaded and ready. Lucky for us, nothing happened, and we got ready to leave once the sun crested the horizon. The drive home was uneventful and without much conversation. When I got home, I immediately undressed and just took a moment to stare in the bathroom mirror. I had a handful of scraped and scratches that I hadn't even noticed. My back was sore, and my right ankle felt a little sharp. That shower was one of the greatest feelings I had ever had. And when I was done, I collapsed on my bed and was instantly asleep for the next 15 hours. Coming face to face with that monstrosity was definitely the scariest moment of my life, and I haven't returned since then. It took over a year to finally get comfortable with being in the woods again, even though I still get a sinking feeling whenever I see the sun setting. What was it? I Don't know. And quite frankly, I'm not interested in finding out. But if we meet again, I'll be sure to have plenty of bullets and a sharp knife with me. We had a tradition of going to see my grandfather every summer and spend some time at his cabin. The cabin by a lake, and older than he is. The cabin is a load of fun for a child spending their carefree summer. The one thing I disliked about the cabin was there was no indoor washroom. A shower was set up outside. An outhouse a few steps off into the woods was the worst thing about the cabin. I hated using that thing. Bugs always took over the inside, and I had a fear of something reaching up to grab me if I sat down. We begged my grandfather to get indoor plumbing. He only got a tub hooked up, but his water heater can only handle so much, so we were banned from using it in the summer. The place was just barely held together. It would be cheaper to buy a new cabin than to renovate it, but we still went every year, always forgetting the negatives, until we finally arrived. Even my father complained about the outhouse, and he never really complained about anything. My grandfather also had a rack of hunting rifles and one shotgun. He told all of us to never touch them, and to respect the weapons. He left the cabinet they were inside locked, his guns unloaded, and the ammo hidden somewhere in the cabin. He took no chances with the guns around a bunch of kids. He always said he would whoop some ass if he ever saw us touching them, and told us it was because he loved us and didn't want an accident to happen. I asked why he kept the guns. I didn't see him using them very often aside from shooting a deer or two. I would see him go off into the woods while we swam with a rifle on his shoulder, but he normally never came back with some animal he shot. I don't think he would kill something to waste, leaving it behind. Or did I think he was a bad shot? He may walk slowly, but his eyesight was better than ours. He always knew what might be going on. One time, my cousin found a cigarette someone dropped near the corner store, where we sometimes got ice cream snacks. He kept it hidden for a day. When he thought that the coast was clear, he used one of the lighters for the fire pit. He didn't even take a drag before our grandfather came out yelling at him, scaring us all to death. With 3 kids crying, begging him not to tell our parents, he gave us mercy. As long as we cleaned the boat we've been putting off all weekend. Overall, my grandfather was a scary man. One night, after telling each other ghost stories to freak each other out, the worst thing happened. When everyone else was dead asleep, I needed to use the restroom. I hated going out at night. It might be only a few steps, and yet it felt like a mile walk. Things croaked off in the woods, which were perfectly normal noises for a forest. When you're a kid, full of ghost stories and listening to these things, those noises turned into killers and ghosts waiting to scoop you up. I went through the cabin to the back door, knowing that I couldn't hold it until morning. There was a flashlight by the door. I turned it on only to have it flicker off. It was the kid's job to make sure the flashlight had new batteries. Sometimes we switched them to out the good ones in the shared Game Boy for a few more hours of playtime. It finally came back to bite us. However, since the full moon was out, I had taken the path 100 times before, so I went on without the flashlight. I feared what my grandfather would do if I woke him up trying to find new batteries. Slipping on my shoes, I went off in the backyard and down the short path to use the washroom. I heard a noise, and I looked over my shoulder and walked faster, fearing what might be looking at me in the dark. That was a mistake. Going without a flashlight and not paying attention to where I was going could have killed me that night. The longer I walked, the more afraid I was. It should not take this long to get to the outhouse. Another crack of a twig made me jump. I could no longer hold it and needed to step off the path to do my business and carry on. I hated going to the washroom out in the woods. At least it was quick, and I was back on the path towards the cabin. But was I? Nothing looked right. The trail appeared too overgrown. I didn't understand how I had gone so far off the path. In my mind, I went the right way the entire time, and I only got lost when I stepped aside. Fear nearly froze me to the spot, forcing my body to move. I started going down where I thought I had came from, praying to find the path again. At this point, I called out for someone to come and get me. A sound came, and I shut my mouth, heart beating so fast that it hurt. I looked around trying to see what was stalking a poor scared kid in the dark. Something flew at me. Wings flapping and a screeching cry made me snap. That's when I ran, screaming, trying to get away from whatever this thing was. Only when I stopped running and was very lost, I realized I just got scared by a bat. Just a normal, harmless bat. I wanted to cry, unless someone noticed I wasn't in my sleeping bag when they woke up to go to the bathroom as well. No one would know I was missing until morning. How long would it take until someone did notice? I skipped breakfast pretty often. They might even assume I was just sleeping in. I didn't want to stay out in the woods overnight. Having no other options or ideas of what to do while lost, I kept walking while trying to force back my tears. I had forgot it was best to stay in one spot while being lost in the woods. Just going deeper in them wasn't the best idea. I felt cold, scared, and was getting bit by bugs. My heart almost broke over the idea of being out there forever, starving to death, and no one ever knowing what happened. Thinking back to the books I needed to read in school, I wonder if I could live out in the woods until they found me. If I find clean water and could figure out how to make a fire, I might be able to. The issue being, I never actually started a fire without a lighter. I tried with sticks, but it always took too long, and we always gave up. Me and my cousins loved burning things and were impatient. There was always a lighter to use. I wanted to try and find the cabin until the sun rose. If I still was in the woods by tomorrow night, I would buckle down to figure out how to make fire. Wait, wouldn't someone smell the smoke and find me sooner? Or would I burn the entire forest down? Getting motivated, I started to look for a clearing that I could use for a fire pit. It took a while, but I found a spot where the ground looked to be mostly dirt. It took longer to find a stone I could use to start digging out a hole in the dirt for my fire pit. My hands cold and the rock cut into my fingers a few times. Then, I needed to find the right sticks to get the fire started. And then finally, get enough wood to keep it going if I did get one started. I didn't go out of sight of the clearing, as I collected what I needed. Exhausted by the time I thought I was ready, my pit was filled with dry leaves and small sticks. I sat down ready to try to get a fire started. I used 2 sticks I peeled the bark off at first. My hands became raw from rubbing them together. Frustrated, I didn't think I could get them warm enough from the friction to get anything started. I then tried a rock method. I didn't know if any rocks would do, or if my grandfather had a special type in his fire starting kit. A miracle of the night happened when I found the right rocks to smash together. One spark caught and I nearly fainted when the leaves burned and yet didn't catch fire. I kept trying until I had a very small flame that I actually fed with my breath. I've never been so proud of myself in my entire life. The smoke blew into my face, causing me to cough and eyes water. Still very happy for my very small fire though. There wasn't a way to tell how long I was out there for. The sun hadn't even risen yet, so at least a few hours. As I warmed myself by the flames, I heard something off in the distance of the woods. I heard it again. My chest got tight with hope when I recognized that the noises I was hearing were human voices. No one I knew. but still someone out here in the woods with me. With my fire still going, I would be able to see my way back to the clearing if needed. I hurried off towards the voices, so happy I couldn't speak.
Mine. Mine.
The voices were a warning for the person they were speaking with. It sounded strange, as if English wasn't their first language. Still, it was someone who could help. At least, that's what I thought. Rushing into another clearing, all my excitement faded when I saw what belonged to those voices. A dead, torn to pieces deer sat in the middle of the small clearing, blood soaking the grass and leaves. In the clear moonlight, I saw 3 pale things, figures, all hunched over in the deer, tearing in with their hands and teeth. All their limbs were skinny and far too long for their bodies. Each of them were pushing aside each other, trying to eat as much of the deer as they could. Skin pale and drawn tight against their bones, faces covered with blood, each of them bald, with a mouth far too large for their face. And their eyes, oh God, their eyes were missing. Each of them had black empty sockets. None of them noticed me. That is, until I let out a scream. All 3 heads darted up. Now knowing there was some fresh prey, I turned to run. Sounds from behind me said they were all starting to chase me. Tears came to my eyes, making it nearly impossible to see where I was going. I slammed into a tree hard enough to hit my arm to the point I thought it was broken. I tumbled to the ground, crying in pain. My moment of weakness enough for one creature to get on top, limbs on either side. The head looking around trying to hear where I was, the large mouth opening, dripping blood on my tear-stained face. The moment before the mouth filled with teeth tore my face off, a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest. The creature blown off. I screamed even more when a powerful hand grabbed my shoulder to drag me to my feet. Grandpa. I choked up when I saw him clearly through my wet eyes. He was holding a shotgun, ready to fire again. His face stern, not afraid or surprised of the creatures. I expected them to attack us. They somehow knew what the gun could do. Grabbing their dead, they dragged it deeper into the darkness. The moment they were out of sight, I heard the worst noise. Awful sounds of bones cracking and breaking. They were eating the one my grandfather had shot. It was all too much for me. I broke down crying, my grandfather silently bending over to pick me up in one arm. As he carried me through the woods, he stomped out my small fire on the way out. He didn't scold me for crying or getting lost. Him actually comforting me that night was the kindest moment we ever shared together. We arrived back by the time the sun was rising. My mother and father awake and worried out of their mind. They scooped me up when we arrived, and I cried all over again. Before we left, I was able to get my grandfather alone to ask him what happened. Those things wouldn't bother us at the cabin. I only saw them because I went too far in the woods. Apparently, he had a deal with them, that they were not to touch any humans as long as he fed them, and he also wasn't sure how many of them lived in the woods, or even what they were. He also said that he fully understood if I didn't want to come back to the cabin next year. I almost didn't, until he passed away of natural causes. I spent parts of my summer at the cabin. He wasn't able to get an indoor toilet, but he did mark the path to the outhouse with those solar charged lamps that people use in their garden to make sure that no one ever goes off the path again. The one and only time I went hunting was with my father when I was 11. My mom didn't work, so it was up to him to provide for us. My entire life he worked more than he was at home. When he did come home, he would drink in front of the TV, too exhausted to do anything. The years crept up on him, and he finally noticed how old I had gotten, and how I was already shaping up to be a disappointment in his eyes. I was small for my age. I stayed inside to read instead of playing sports. My body was so frail I got sick often. When he finally truly looked at me for the first time, he didn't recognize the son that lived in his house. Therefore, he thought that hunting would be the answer. If I would man up and shoot something, maybe I might grow into the person he wanted. We never really spent any time together. Hunting with my father felt like being stuck inside a forest with a stranger. What kind of person even enjoys camping? Was I even missing something? My father kept sipping away at a steel water bottle that I knew didn't have water inside. Without it, he never would have lasted the day. We caught no fish at the lake for lunch the first day. Trying out luck, we went into the forest trying to shoot something for dinner. We packed something to eat, but not much. My father worked hard. However, he was supporting all three of us on his own. I knew it would be four of us soon. My mom hadn't told him yet, and I wasn't sure how he would take it. I really prayed she would leave him. As heartless as that was to hope for, we could go to my uncle's house, so my father could be alone. Maybe retire in a few years without having to worry about supporting a family. Even as a child, I could see how much his job broke his body, a little more every day. In my mind, my mother didn't have any kind of feelings for this stranger. Instead of going outside playing with neighborhood friends, I worried about my family's future. In the woods, hunkered down, my father waited for something to come into his sight. For the first time, he made the attempt to talk with me and teach me things. After a while, when he thought I could be trusted, he placed the rifle into my hands and let me get into position. It was far too big for my short arms and little hands. I was scared that if I shot it, the recoil would break my shoulder. I didn't know the first thing about guns. In the movies I had seen, they always had a powerful recoil. Line it up, our dinner's over there, my father whispered in my ear. A rabbit came into a clearing. He spotted it first, looking through the sight. I went through everything I had just learned. I only needed to pull the trigger. Such a simple little thing. My father would teach me more things patiently and be proud of me. The first hunting trip with his son would become a cherished memory. But it didn't go like that. I froze up. I just couldn't shoot the rabbit. Aside from not wanting to kill another living creature, I felt like if I shot it, I would be living a lie. My father would try his best to act like the person he should be, teaching me how to skin the rabbit and how to cook it. But he would not actually care about me. He never did. This trip would never turn into a family relationship he wanted. The small rabbit jumped off and out of sight to become a meal for something else. I eased up the grip on the rifle the moment before it was snatched from my hands. My father shot at the rabbit now hidden in the bush. "Why didn't you shoot it?" he hissed at me. When he got angry, his voice got low. He was never the type to yell and scream. I wonder if he did shout at me, I might be less scared of him. Whenever I had a nightmare, it was always the same. My father sitting in the living room in the dark, staring at the TV. I stood in the doorway looking at him, just waiting. The waiting crept dread into my bones. I hated the wait. I wish he would just finally scream at me. I couldn't stand his silent rage any longer. "Go back to camp. You're useless." Those words should have done nothing to me. After all, this man wasn't my father. Not really. He was a stranger. And yet, I felt my face full of shame. But I still didn't regret not shooting the rabbit. I went back to the camp trying to make myself useful. I collected firewood, I cleaned up, and did anything else that I thought would make my father happy. I heard the sound of a truck. We parked pretty close by, and my stomach sank at the thought of him just leaving me here. But our gear cost a lot of money. He will leave his son in the woods, but not things he worked hard for. For hours I was alone in the tent. I brought a book along. I nearly finished it by the time my father returned. He smelled drunk and like fast food. I knew he had gone into town for supper and a few drinks alone. I only ate a hot dog and a handful of marshmallows. The arrangement was fine by me. The rest of the night he spent by the fire, just drinking. The scene identical to how he spent time at home, just looking forward yet not taking anything in. He stayed outside even after night fell. I went back into our tent trying to sleep, finding it impossible. I thought about how things would change when my new sibling came, if they ever made it to that point. I feared that my father would try to make sure that he didn't have another mouth to feed. I wanted nothing more to get away from that man, even though in a way, he had never done anything to me. The nothing made me feel as if something was coming. At some point I fell asleep, but some rustling outside woke me up. In my drowsy state I sat up hearing my father's voice outside. "Take him, please. Not me." He was crying. The man that I didn't know a thing about was crying. His voice was very faint, as if far away, more begging and pleading until I heard something that made me scramble into the corner of the tent. He finally broke the silence, and the noise I always dreaded came. He screamed, and just kept screaming as if his life depended on it. Clutching my knees to my chest, tears came to my eyes as I could do nothing but listen. Cracks from the rifle came. Whatever he was firing at, he missed, or it didn't care. The entire exchange only took a few minutes that felt like years. Finally, his voice drifted away, as if he was being dragged at a fast pace. At first, I wanted to stay inside the tent until morning. I cried hard until my throat felt raw and my eyes hurt. When my crying spell stopped, I decided to see if he dropped the rifle. I would need a weapon until I could leave when dawn came. I unzipped the tent only enough to peek outside. The dying fire did not give enough light to see by. I needed to go outside. Finding a flashlight, I carefully got out, hyper aware of every sound around me. Scanning the ground, I saw the hot dogs were still where I left them. If my father was attacked by a wild animal, why didn't they take these as well? Did the smell attract something, and decided a full-grown man would be a better meal? I saw no sign of the rifle, only tracks in the dirt where my father made his last stand. I felt sick because I realized he was coming towards the camp instead of the truck when he got snatched away. He was either trying to save me or wanted to use me as bait. Thinking the truck would be a better place to wait until the morning, I started to look around trying to find a trail towards it. I stopped when I heard a voice. "Please, not me. Help." It sounded so hurt and awful, but I knew that was my father calling out. For the first time in my life, he was trying to reach me. I abandoned the idea of the truck. I foolishly turned away and went towards the voice. For hours I walked in those woods getting hopelessly lost. I felt sick with fear. Anything could be in the dark, and I only had a small flashlight to protect myself. Whatever took my father easily overpowered a full-grown man. I didn't have a choice if it came across me. I would let my emotions take over and it might get me killed. Then again, I was only a child back then, so I shouldn't be too hard on myself. "Please, please." The voice came from close by, very low and raspy, but still my father's voice. I had been walking for hours at that point. My small body wasn't meant to move this much in the cold, wet darkness. I knew a fever already coming, and wasn't thinking clearly as I walked towards the voice. I didn't even consider it may be someone else aside from who I wanted to find. Coming into a clearing, I started to look around with my flashlight. The small beam of light landed on something that made me choke on air. Someone killed a deer, skinned it, and hung it from a tree. In the darkness, that's what it looked like. I knew what a skinned deer looked like. It's what my mind wanted to see. The kill was so fresh, blood still dripped down onto the grass. I couldn't stop myself from starting to take a shorter and shorter breath when a whisper of a thought came to my mind that the body wasn't a deer. That's not him, I said out loud, only to myself. That's not him, it's a deer. It's a small deformed deer with small legs. Unable to stop myself, I suddenly hunched over and threw up my meal from hours before, mostly bile that stung my throat. Seeing such a sight in the dark made me completely snap. Instead of screaming, I started to laugh, on my knees alone, lost and scared beyond words. Weak chuckles at first, that turned into a cackling, that soon turned into heavy sobs that locked up my chest. It's not him. I was sobbing, holding myself, not being able to look at the body in front of me. After getting another few glances between tears, I saw how different the legs were compared to what deer legs should look like. I only held on to some hope it wasn't my father skinned and hanging from a tree, because I had just heard him a few minutes before entering the clearing. The kill was new, but skinning took a while, even if you knew what you were doing. In the next few moments, I saw why my hope was unfounded. I forced myself to stop crying when I saw a pale face in the dark on the other end of the clearing. The face looked at me through the trees, just beyond the skinned body. I opened my mouth to ask for help, but nothing came out aside from a croak. To my horror, the face came out of the trees with the rest of its terrible body. I didn't understand what I was seeing, even though the pale creature stood out in the darkness. I wanted to believe I was still in my tent dreaming this entire thing. The monster was a thing of nightmares. It was skinny, so much so I could see every bone in its body. It had arms so long they walked on its elbows, the rest of its arms folding backwards, sticking up above its head. The same was for its legs. It crawled on its knees, legs pointed up towards the sky. The pale thing saw me. Inhuman sunken eyes on a flat human-shaped face. Standing up, I thought I could run. It was still a few feet away, and judging from how deformed its body was, I doubt it could move very fast. I only got to take a single step back when it raised an arm. The rest of its arm snapped ahead, easily covering the distance of the clearing. I assumed it couldn't reach more with its entire arm because it was bent back, but I was mistaken. Twisted fingers grabbed the front of my shirt. I was dragged, too in shock to do anything. Raising me up, I met those horrible black eyes. The smell of rotting breath nearly made me pass out. I was so small and frail I could do nothing to fight against this monster. Most likely my father was dead. It would skin me and eat me, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. The whole situation was so bleak. I surprised myself over what I did next. I started to laugh again. The monster's features twisted in confusion. I still laughed until tears came back to my eyes, and that thing, whatever it was, copied me. It laughed my own voice back towards me, and we both ended up laughing until I physically couldn't any longer. I wish I had an explanation of how I escaped from that creature. I was told later that I had been found on a hiking trail. A week later, nearly starved to death. Even after my body recovered, my mind didn't. Everyone assumed I had killed my father in those woods, and the event just broke me. I wish I could believe that, and that the creature I had seen wasn't real. I don't remember the 2 years after I had been found. I ate and slept, not doing much else. One day, I weakly laughed at a joke I overheard. When the doctors found out I would react to any kind of comedy, they were able to get me to laugh myself back to a new normal. I remember seeing that monster in the woods. Then, I was with my mother and a new little sister. No memories in between. I haven't yet told her about that creature. They found some rope with my father's blood on it. However, they didn't know where his body was, or even how I got up into the tree to tie up that rope to start with. The case was still open, and would be for the rest of my life. I do still want to give a warning to everybody about that thing in the woods. I'm sure it's still out there waiting. I don't know why it let me go. Maybe it was thankful I had given it the perfect voice to draw in others towards it. So if you ever go into the woods and you hear a child laughing, don't go towards it. That's actually the time to leave before it's too late. I want to start the story off by saying that I am Navajo. I live in Utah, and growing up, my family never mentioned skinwalkers or witches to me, so I know nothing about them. My grandpa died just before the summer, so my parents sent me to live with my grandma to help her around her ranch. For company, I brought my cat along with me. He was an orange tabby. We had only been there 2 weeks when my cat went missing. I figured that he would come back, but he never did. I called him and looked for him, but nothing. A few days later, I was bringing some hay out behind the barn when something orange caught my eye. It was the remains of my cat. By the looks of it, he was attacked by something, most likely a coyote. They're all around here. However, when I picked it up, I used a pitchfork, and I immediately noticed that there were no bones. It was just a pile of skin and fur, but I also noticed that there were small splotches of what seemed to be red, yellow, and white paint. At first I thought he might have gotten into something, but the way the paint was on his fur, if you told me someone had put it there on purpose, I'm not sure you would be wrong. Even though there wasn't much left to him, I did love him, and I was heartbroken. So I put his remains in a wood box that my grandmother had in the barn and buried him behind a hill. I marked his final resting spot with a nice stone I found, and so that everyone would know he was there, I painted his name and the date in neat white letters and numbers. Only a couple of nights later, I was hearing just outside the hogan and something scratching at the door. My grandmother, however, doesn't have any other cat, and I don't remember seeing any hanging around the ranch. Regardless, I go over and open the door, or at least look out, and each time there was nothing. After a couple of nights of this, I decided, come the morning, to go check on my cat's grave. When I got out to the hill, I saw that the stone was still in place, and nothing looked disturbed. But something told me it wasn't right. I went back to the barn for a shovel, and came back and carefully dug up the grave. I removed the box, and before opening it, said a little prayer. When I took off the lid, you can imagine my surprise when his fur and skin were gone, and instead, the box now contained his bones. At least I thought they were his. I just couldn't believe it. I know for a fact that when I buried that box, it was with fur and skin, and not a bone in sight. I wish I could say that this incident was the only strangeness that I experienced while living there, but it's not. As a result, my respect for the Navajo Nation, what the elders say, and for skinwalkers has now grown. I'm not saying I was involved with one, but now I really believe and know why our elders don't talk about them. What I will tell you is, don't seek them out. Stop researching about them. Stop thinking about them. You're basically inviting them into your life, because even with small attention that you give them, they will come looking for you. When we first moved into my grandpa's old cabin, I had a few obvious reasons to be afraid. First of all, I was 12 years old. Second, we moved in because our old house had burned down while we were away on vacation. And finally, my grandpa was a sick, old man. Not in the sense that he had some sort of illness. Well, I suppose he did. But that illness is what ended up killing him, giving us that forsaken cabin. But in the sense that he was batshit insane. When I was younger, my grandfather would tell me horrible stories about the cabin he lived in and the woods around it. He would tell me stories of the natives who lived in the forest, something about them being cursed by God for worshipping false gods, being turned into the trees themselves, if you look closely, while not looking at all. My sadistic grandpa would say that you can still see the trees move, and if you listen carefully, you could even hear them singing their worship for their false gods. I, of course, assumed he was just crazy and was trying to scare me from wandering off in the woods, and possibly also to motivate me to go to church. But still, since I was 8 freaking years old and all, I would sometimes see a branch twitch in the wind, or hear the faint noise of a distant animal, and I would worry it was one of the natives that my grandpa would go crazy over. But of course, the stories didn't finish there. Not only was this cabin the original home to a clan of witches, but also home to a cannibal and at least 2 serial killers, and a family that used to worship the devil. To make the whole illusion complete, my grandpa made up a story how he won the cabin in a game of Russian roulette against one of the previous owners. All of these stories never truly scared me. They terrified me when I thought about one of them too much, but I was actually never fearful of the stories being true. Well, except for one story that my grandfather told me. He said before the cabin was built that the natives used the area for human sacrifices, offering up human flesh and blood not only for their gods, but for creatures they believed that dwelled in the woods. These creatures, my grandfather would say, were known by many names in all kinds of folklore: Wendigos, the Jersey Devil, demons, White Walkers, Skinwalkers, the Goat Man. But my grandpa would always call them Machar de Poule. It's French for Skinwalker. These beings of divine or mystical power were known to feed off anything from human flesh and blood to a human soul, or even fear itself. The Skinwalker would stalk their prey throughout the woods they inhabited if the sacrifice given was not enough to feed their hunger. They always attacked groups of people, never a single person. That's the reason why my grandfather said that he lived alone. The Skinwalkers would play with their food, often turning their form to look human to trick and torment anyone they sought to feed off, before finally killing them. My grandfather said once they finished feeding off of anyone unlucky enough, they would peel the skin from bone and wear it like a suit, often visiting the families of the dead to further torment mankind. The reason the story scared me so much was because I truly believed I saw one. When I was 8, I was playing in the backyard of the cabin. My grandfather sitting on the back porch, smoking his pipe and humming some old tune. He told me he was going to go inside and fetch some more tobacco, and he warned me not to go too close to the woods. I nodded and kept doing whatever I was doing at the time. After a few minutes, I felt the air around me turn cold, and everything seemed to get heavier, and I began to smell something like pennies, and the cold grew stronger. I realized it smelled exactly like blood. I felt a chill run up my spine, and I nearly gagged on the metallic taste that lingered in my mouth. I was about to stand and move back inside the cabin when I heard a soft laugh faintly beyond the tree line. I realized it sounded just like my own laugh, but now I was already scared. So scared I could hardly move at all. The smell of copper grew so strong that I thought I might pass out. But then, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I swallowed my spit and slowly turned to see a little boy standing just in front of the forest. I was almost relieved until I saw his eyes. They were pure white with no pupil, just pure white. I felt my knees buckle under me, and my lip began to quiver when it smiled at me. But when it smiled, the teeth were missing, and it was just a set of black, rotting gums that I could smell from several yards away. It lurked ahead, doubling over, seeming to hack and gag and laugh all at the same time. Then, it bent backward, placing its hands on the ground, and looked at me from between its legs. I swear I could hear bones break and crack as it began to crawl backwards into the forest, all the while making this gagging, laughing sound. That's when I passed out and wet my pants. I woke up a few minutes later from my grandfather gently shaking me up. The smell had magically disappeared, and there was no evidence of the creature I had saw just a few minutes ago. I told my grandfather what I had saw, and he grew so pale he almost looked like the little boy's eyes. He drove me back to my house, not saying a word the whole way. I told my parents what happened, and I was assured I must have just fell asleep and dreamed the whole thing. So eventually, that's what I convinced myself had happened. It still haunted my dreams, but I was convinced it was my imagination, and my grandfather's old stories were just getting to me. But then, we moved into my grandfather's cabin. Since we had lost all of our belongings in the fire, we had nothing to unpack. Even though I had convinced myself that I dreamed what I saw all those years ago, I was still worried about living there for an extended period of time. My parents let me watch some movies we rented while they were cleaning the cabin that had been vacant since my grandfather died when I was 10. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up on the couch a bit surprised I had fallen asleep for so long. As I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I became aware of the tapping that was coming from the front door, almost as if someone was knocking with their fingertips. Even though I had no real idea what it was, I got up to check on it. Then, I smelled it again, that heavy, thick, bloody smell that had lingered in the back of my mind for 4 years. It got so cold so fast I could see my own breath. I felt my heart thumping in my chest, and that same shiver run up my spine. I was so scared in that moment I thought I was going to break down and start crying. Then the tapping stopped. Then the smell grew worse. Beyond the front door I heard something gag and cough and laugh at the same time. My knees buckled and my lip quivered just like they did the first time. I became vaguely aware that I was slowly backing away from the door when I tripped and fell back onto the couch. Then I passed out again. Again, like the first time, I woke up from a hand gently shaking me away. I woke up and realized it was my dad looking down at me. It looked like he was out of breath, but I was so relieved he was there, and that the tapping on the door was all a dream. I then smiled at him, and he tried to do the same, but he only managed to get one side of his lips curled up. I was about to ask what was wrong when he scooped me up in his arms and told me in a hoarse voice that he was carrying me to my bed. His arms were so cold they felt like metal, but I didn't care, and I was already falling asleep again. He brought me to my room and laid me down in bed. His eyes were already closed and my mind was about to drift off. He leaned down and I felt his cold breath on my ear as my mind shut down and he pulled away, and just before I fell back into sweet sleep, I heard my dad begin to cough. A few hours passed and I woke up again. I grew scared when I remembered the tapping on the door, but soon felt better when I remembered that it must have been a dream, and was thankful my dad woke me up to carry me to my room. I sat up in bed, still just a bit scared. I looked around my room, realizing that this was the first time I actually seen it since I had fallen asleep on the couch, before I even had a chance to check out my new room. It was almost pitch black, so I could hardly see anything. I gazed over to the wall and saw a mirror. It was hard to see, but I could make out my face and my upper body. I smiled at myself and saw my reflection smile back at me. Satisfied, I went back to sleep. In the morning, my dad again gently shook me awake. He said good morning and asked what I wanted for breakfast. I told him what I wanted and then thanked him for carrying me to the bed the night before. He looked at me, confused, and told me that he didn't, but I wasn't listening anymore, because when I looked at the wall, just as I had looked at it last night, I realized there wasn't a mirror in my room, only a window. Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least the general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this theme or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday, and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities, and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night, and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us three were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area. and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home. Here's what happened. My cousin is sleeping over. He's the same age as me. We're both 13 at this time. We're in my room, talking and hanging out. It is around maybe 11 p.m. It is a pleasant summer evening, so my window is wide open. It's also pretty dark outside, and my dad is in the living room watching TV. But as always, he's dozed off on the couch. My mom has already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but we're not ready yet to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and slam shut. We think it's my dad. My mom, she tells us the next day she hears footsteps on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom, so she naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she realizes that she's unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still, in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only this time more loud. It wakes up my dad, and he comes to my bedroom to check on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him we were by ourselves, and that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face, he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He then leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we could do is shrug. The next morning, My mom tells us about what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she then hears what sounds like a horse galloping by her bedroom window. She then has all of us pray, and now, every year, we hike up the mountain to a high point and we pray for protection from evil. This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say, an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limp, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body. My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkling a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, I lived outside a reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside with good dirt for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some old abandoned farmsteads. Pa Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky, and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember it so much. The engine began to sputter, and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "Damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road. As it coasted to a stop, my pa said, "Stay here, son," and he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool down the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up the smell of one of those dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get very hot. The wind stopped blowing, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called out. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light across the partly open hood. Grandfather paused telling the story. He spit a fat piece of tobacco to his side, and he looked very pensive into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was breezy, but I was sweating and clammy. "What about your father? What did you see?" My grandfather, continuing the story, sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends. Old legends. Much older than what's out there in the valley. Older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, than the old chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hopi and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples. They told tales. They told stories about dark magic. Something about a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white men that came for their land and women. They called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and looked towards the fire, to the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and then leaned a little bit and said, "They would call them Skinwalkers, old warriors, resurrected as skinless men, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but they were messed up, long and disfigured, teeth like a Bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 feet tall, even hunched over. They would gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'll run through the bullets, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. And boy, could they change their voice to match a person you knew or might know. And that's what I saw, big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road, gray and molted, muscle flexing under its legs, clumping on the road, stringy muscle hunched shoulders. And it turned, looked right into the cab, and looked at me, right into my eyes. And I swear, it grinned at me. I sank into my seat. In fear, shaking, I knew my death was coming. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes. and blows a tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for Pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I started to shake as my grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I knew he lived. But the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legend says, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin that they were wearing would come looking for their mortal shell, before going to whatever hell awaited them. Even though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting up my hands to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said. Before climbing into the cab, he got the steering wheel and pulled himself in an awkward way, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. Your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my mom right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all those camps. And now, I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run? Or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your mom, as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out into the road. And our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom? I knew, because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I saw that same beast running 50 miles an hour right next to our car, looking at me with those yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us. My pa kept his eyes on the road, looking straight ahead. "Son," he said, "don't look at it." That's how I knew it was my dad. He knew what to do, and he kept telling me to just keep looking straight ahead and to not look at whatever was around us, running. He then told me that by acknowledging its presence, you give it power. That's where my grandfather finished the story. I kept staring at him, but by this time, he was just looking straight ahead, looking around me, and said we should go inside. As we went inside the house, he then told me to not ever mention skinwalkers. He also said that speaking their name out loud or mentioning them at all, even in text, even in stories, even if someone else is telling you a story, is supposed to make them aware of your existence. So we end up playing football, dicking around with me. There's the white kid Tanner, 5 of my cousins, and then 4 of their friends. In total, there were 5 girls and 6 boys. We all were around 15 to 17. We ended up just dicking the day away. So we head back to the camp and pulling out some stuff for a campfire. Even though the trailers had kitchens, Tanner says that his family's property sits up against my uncle's. He wants to run home and ask his dad if he can come out camping with us. My cousin Rooster says he's going to go with him since it's going to get dark soon. And one of the girls also wants to tag along. It's about 7 o'clock and it's starting to get pretty dark. They take flashlights and take the trail to Tan's property. The rest of us chill. We make s'mores, drink, and kiss on the girls. About 30 to 40 minutes later, there's the smell of ozone again. You could smell it over the smell of the fire we had started. It was a nasty copper smell like right after you had a nosebleed, and it stopped. It wasn't exactly like dry blood, but it was that nasty metallic back of your throat smell kind of. We immediately think it's some kind of electrical malfunction, or someone left a hot plate on, or some shit like that. We search all the trailers, and nothing is on, and we can all smell it now. All of a sudden, we can hear people booking down the path towards us, and Rooster, Tan, and the girl all come running into the clearing, out of breath. And they don't even break stride, they all run into the trailer, right by where the fire is. So of course, we all get the fuck out of there, and into the trailers we go as well. They end up calming down. Even Rooster is crying his fucking eyes out at this point. All the while, the fire is going lower and lower. So my cousins say, fuck it. And they're about to go outside to get the generator out of a shed between the trailers. But then Tanner goes, fuck no, lock the front door. Ain't nobody else going outside. He's been crying too, and his eyes are bloodshot and puffy, and his pants are dirty as shit. He goes on to tell us that they went up to his house. His father said sure, he could go out camping, but to make sure they were careful on the way back, and that maybe they should take one of the hunting rifles, just in case. Evidently, Tanner had seen something in their yard a few days before. One of their pigs had come up, ripped up, and was half eaten. They assumed it was just some big cat or coyote, even though they usually don't fuck with live animals. He had gone upstairs and packed the stuff, and told his dad they would be okay without the rifle, because coyotes avoid people. So they started walking back to where we were camping at. So Rooster finally stops crying and shaking. The girl already had, but she was just staring out the window with a dumb look on her face. He says they had gotten halfway into the woods towards the camp when they started to hear shit in the forest. It was almost pitch black by this time, so they weren't sure at first what the fuck it was. The girl says that she heard something in the bushes right off the trail, and they all beamed their flashlights over there, and there was someone standing back in the woods. Rooster said they shouted at him and told him that he was scaring the fuck out of them and what a dick he was. He says that's when he realized that the guy was actually facing away from them. So they keep walking. They say that they look off into the forest on the opposite side, and there's a dude standing in the forest, backwards, slightly closer to the path. So now they start power walking, and Tan keeps going, I should have taken the fucking rifle. As they're telling the story, the smell is still super strong, even inside the cabin. They say that after they started walking faster, a kind of low gibbering had started coming from both sides of the woods. And as they started booking it back to the trailer, the girl said she had flashed her flashlight out into the woods to the side of them and had seen something jerking itself through the woods. The gibbering just got louder and louder, and when they could see the light from our campfire, something had come out of the woods, about 40 yards behind them, onto the track. And that's when they just flat out ran, as hard as they could, to the trailer. So we're out in the fucking woods, and we're assuming at this point, it's some rednecks, or some shit trying to fuck with us. All of a sudden, my other cousin, Junior, starts going on about how he went to school with a native kid that was telling him about the goat man, or some shit like that. We promptly tell him to shut the fuck up, because we don't need any spooky talk right now. But he just keeps going on and on about how it's the fucking goat man, and how we're in his woods, and blah blah blah. At that time, I had never heard of this goat man, or any of that. But then a couple years ago, the year before I graduated from college, I had a native roommate, and I ended up asking him about it. And to sum it up, it's basically a fucking man with the head of a goat, and he gets among groups of people to scare them. It's also supposed to be kind of like the Wendigo, and it's bad mojo to even talk about it. And it's even worse, if you see it. Keep in mind, I don't know this back when I was 16. So my cousin starts saying, the goat man's going to get in and fucking get us. The girls are all terrified, and my cousins and I are all fucking trying to figure out if it's just some bullshit, or some hillbillies, or some animal. So all of a sudden, the smell just goes away. Like to this day, I haven't even experienced anything like it. Most of the time, smells fade away or just lessen. But in this case, it literally was there 1 second and then not the second after. So it's after an hour, making it around 9 or 10. We stopped shitting bricks enough to go back outside and stoke the fire again. We figured it was just some assholes trying to fuck with us. So we don't go back home because we think if we do, they'll chase us through the woods or some crazy shit like that. Nothing else weird happens that night, and we stay another night, and for the main part of the night, nothing happens. At about 1 in the morning, we're outside getting drunk and telling ghost stories. As someone is finishing their scary story, which I don't remember what it's about, the smell comes back. This time, it's so fucking strong that one of the girls literally starts vomiting. I stand up and you can actually feel how clammy the air is. I then say that we should get inside, and this doesn't feel right. In reality, we should have just fucking left. We all go back inside and we're standing around. My cousin just keeps going on about how it's the goat man, and my cousin Rooster keeps trying to shut him the fuck up, and all the while I'm just feeling that something is wrong, and I can't figure out what the fuck it is. We end up sitting in there for a while. The smell is just as strong, and we're terrified and all huddle in this camper. We end up cooking brats for everybody because nobody wants to go outside. It's one of those packs with 4 brats. We have a total of 3 packs. I grill them up on the stove and give everybody a hot dog. I get mine, and after a while, one of my cousins gets up and goes over to the pot to get another one. He starts grumbling about how I get 2 brats and everybody else only got 1. And I look at him like he's fucking stupid. I tell him that everybody only got 1 because there were only 12 brats. If he wants more, he should open up a new pack and cook some more. That's when the girl that had been out with Rooster and Tan just starts screaming, "Oh Jesus, oh Lord, get it out." She's crying and shivering, and then it dawns on the cousin standing up what the fuck is wrong. Me and him both glance around the room, and then I feel my heart fucking sink. I run the fuck out of the cabin, and the girl runs out with us. The trailer door is banging against the side of the trailer as everybody books out of the cabin. One of my cousin's friends then asks what the fuck was wrong. I start counting all of us, and there's only 11 of us now. I shit you not, my cousin verified. There had been 12 people in the cabin, but being that everybody didn't really know each other well, nobody had really noticed the whole fucking time that there was an extra person. And then I realized earlier that I had kind of noticed something was off. You know how when you're just dicking around having a good time, that you don't sweat the smallest shit, and you don't always keep track of certain stuff? I'm dead sure that someone else had been in the trailer with us, and that they had been there for at least a fucking day, eating with us. What makes it worse is, I could figure out which one, because I don't think anyone ever actually interacted with the other person / the goat man. The girl kept praying to Jesus, and we're all sitting outside. Eventually, we get big ass sticks and go back in the cabin, but there's nobody in there. We count again, and there's 11 people. We go back into the trailer and lock the door. We explain what the fuck happened, and the girl says that she also realized, and that when he was about to say something, the person sitting next to her had grabbed her leg hard and leaned over towards her and said something she couldn't understand. So we are pretty much scared as fuck as we huddle together, and I fall asleep. When I wake up, the sun is just coming up, and half the people are asleep, and the other half are packing our shit up. We all want to walk back home, but like 4 people want to stay until the sun is all the way up, and some people think that we're just fucking around and still want to stay there. I just want to get the fuck out of the woods, to be honest. The girl's name was Kiera, the one that the goat man had touched. Anyways, I asked her if she really thinks it was something bad, and she says that she just wants to go home and she doesn't want to be out in the woods alone for another night. So we decided to split up. The 4 that want to go can go, but I have to stay because I have the keys to the cabin, and it's my uncle's and I have to lock up. I'm super pissed off at this point because I feel like people aren't taking the shit seriously, and I definitely didn't want to be out in the woods for another night. I spend the rest of the day trying to convince the rest of the people, which is now 4 girls and 4 guys, to get the fuck out. Tanner leaves with them to go get a rifle and says he's going to be back. So now there are just 7 of us left by 4 p.m. At around 5 p.m. he hasn't made it back yet, and we're getting extremely fucking nervous. And the only reason I stopped begging them to go back was because he went to go get a gun. It's about 5:30 p.m. or so when the one cousin that did stay says that the girl Kiera is outside. We all look outside, and sure enough, she's standing by the fire pit with her back to the cabin. I'm thinking to myself, if she was so fucking scared, why the hell would she come back? And then I get this nasty feeling in my gut. Keep in mind, the whole time the coppery smell has been gone. Now I realize I can smell just a little bit of it. I say this to the rest of them and everybody. And these are the people that wanted to stay in the fucking woods after we had the goddamn goat man in our midst, is laughing at me and asking if I set this up to scare them. I'm looking at them like, I'm not fucking bullshitting you all right now. I then demand to know why the fuck would I play like that. So one of the girls goes outside to get Kiera. She gets halfway to her and stops cold. Kiera starts heaving. I don't know how the fuck to describe it. Sort of like if someone with their back turned was laughing without actually making any sound. It was this fact that made me realize there was not a fucking sound in the whole woods. It was dead silent. This was like later in September, so it was still fairly hot at the time, but it was super chilly some days too, and you could usually hear some big ass geese honking or some kind of birds or squirrels chit-chatting. So I step out of the door and tell her to come back in the fucking trailer right fucking now. She backs up into the trailer and we lock the fucking door. We pulled down all the shades except one and put a guy there in a chair to watch her. She stands there for another 20 minutes or so. The guy then turns to say that she's still there, and then there's a huge fucking bang at the door. We all jump the fuck up and scramble around the living room. The banging is super fucking loud. So now my cousin is holding one of the girls and the other 2 are kind of giggling, nervously laughing, and me and the other 2 guys are shitting bricks. Then we hear Tan. He's screaming, "Let me the fuck in, stop fucking playing." So we go over to the door and open it, and he stumbles in with a rifle. There's nobody else outside. Evidently, he had walked up to the campsite. Nothing weird happened in the forest, but he had seen a girl, mind you. He said it was not Kiera standing there. When he had gotten to the edge of the clearing, she had turned towards him with a slack-jawed look and just stared him down, slowly tracking him as he walked around the outside of the clearing towards the camp. He said it wasn't until he was almost halfway to the trailer he had realized that she was getting closer to him. She had started off by the fire, and without him even seeing her move, she had been turning inches closer. He said he just ran the rest of the way back to the cabin, thinking it would open, and when he got to the door, it was locked. He turned, and it was about half the distance to the door. He looks around the room, and then gets super pale. He pulls me to the side and whispers in my ear, "You know there are only 7 of us in here, right?" I get that feeling where your stomach drops to your nuts. It had been back inside the trailer while we were out sorting out who was going where, and then when we all went outside to talk earlier in the day. It has just slipped right back in. We looked out the window and there is nobody out there, so we recount everyone, and then basically I go over and ask everyone how many people were here earlier, and everybody says 8. I then say, well, how many are here now? They all do the count and then realize there are only now 7 people in the cabin. So Tan had brought back a couple of boxes of ammo and his rifle, and he had told his dad there was some kind of animal in the forest because he didn't think his dad would believe him if he said it was the goat man. He said that his cousin is supposed to be coming down in a few hours, and that in the morning we can all go back to his place and his cousin will drive us home. Now I'm really fucking terrified, but I at least feel better because we can be American and shoot the fuck out of whatever it is if it comes back. But then my cousin gets into this huge argument with one of the girls because she thinks that I'm trying to be funny and prank them, and that she's getting really scared and that I'm not funny. He keeps telling her I'm not that kind of person, and she says, well, how do we know the girl wasn't just Tanner in a wig? Or if it's really the goat man? How do we know that this is real? How do we know that this is the real Tanner and that the goat man just didn't kill Tanner in the woods and take his gun? So we fucking get into a huge argument about this, where me and Tan are like, we could seriously be in danger because at the very least someone has been sneaking themselves into our fucking trailer without us knowing and mingling with us. And at worst, something bad is in the forest fucking with us. One of the girls starts crying and saying that she wants to go home right now. And we're trying to tell her that we shouldn't because none of us are walking through the woods in the middle of the night. At this point, the sun is starting to go down and it's getting a little cloudy outside. We eat something and turn on the radio for a while, but we really can't get a station out there with anything decent. So we turn it off at about the time that Tan's cousin shows up. He was like 19, I think. At this point, the sun is just barely over the horizon, and he has one of those heavy-duty lantern flashlights and another rifle. He walks up to the trailer, and we whisper to Tan, asking him if he's sure that's his cousin, and he says yes. The guy looks behind him and all around the camp, then walks in. He kind of glances at all of us and looks a little confused. He says, "Where's your other little buddy at?" I figured she would meet up at the cabin. Is she a little slow or something? He also asked whether we had been cooking blood in the cabin because it smelled like blood and hot pans all the way up the trail. We all say at the same time, fucking no, but we ask him what the fuck he's talking about with the girl he saw. He had come down the same trail Tan had been using, and he had come up on one of your guy's buddies, standing in the middle of the trail, looking at him, slack-jawed. He had asked her a bunch of questions, but all she did was just look at him. Then she smiled at him, and he said he kept walking. She couldn't seem to keep up with him, and kept lagging a little behind him. He said he asked her if she was hurt or something, and if she needed any help, but she just continued to stare. Eventually, he had been walking and turned around a bend in the trail, but when he turned around and went back to see if she was okay, the trail was empty. So he assumed that she must have taken a shortcut through the woods to our trailer. We tell him the whole story of what's been going on. I half expected him to say we were full of shit, but he just listened and then sat down on the couches in the living room. Tanner's cousin gets back to the girl. He says when she had kept trying to lag behind him, it had kind of weirded him the fuck out, so he tried to keep her in front of him, but no matter how slow he walked, she was always lagging a little bit behind, and that he smelled this nasty smell, and it got stronger as he got to the camp. Eventually, it got really strong. She had said something really low that he didn't catch, and when he had turned around, she had been right the fuck up on him, and he stepped back from her. It was at this point he asked her if she was okay, and if she wasn't, he would carry her back the rest of the way, but instead, she stayed quiet and just kept staring. He said that's when he reached out for her, as in to grab her on the shoulder, but he must have misjudged the distance because she was off to the side where he had put his hand, like she had moved while he was looking dead at her. So at this point, we know the shit's real, unless Tan is playing a joke. which we can tell he's not because he's almost pissing his pants. So they load up their rifles, we eat some more, and we just kind of sit around until about 11. To this fucking day, every time I think about this, I really pray to God that it's not some huge prank that my cousins played on me and just never revealed, so I was shit for the rest of my life. At around 11, the stink of copper turns into an actual nasty, gross, blood-like smell, like cooking blood and hair. Tan and his cousin Reese get the fuck up instantly and grab the rifles. There's like a half knock, half claw at the door, and I shit you not, there's this voice, and it sounds like when you see those YouTube cats and YouTube dogs whose owners teach them how to, quote, talk. So after the half knocking and half clawing at the door, it says in this weird toned voice,
Let me the fuck in. Stop fucking playing.
It made my fucking nuts creep up against my body, and one of the girls just starts crying and calling on Jesus. It was so fucking obviously not a person talking. It didn't have the right cadence, and that's some shit that I never realized until that moment. But all the people have a certain cadence when they talk, no matter what language. All people have a certain kind of rhythm to talking. This shit didn't have any kind of cadence. One of those YouTube cats, that's what the fuck it sounded like outside the door. So now I'm in full on terror mode. We keep yelling outside, who is it? Stop fucking around, man. And just keep saying,
Let me the fuck in.
for almost about 15 minutes.
Let me the fuck in. Let me the fuck in. Let me the fuck in.
But if you can't imagine how this shit sounded, then you can't imagine how fucked up the whole situation was. So then the smell goes away for a while, and for the next hour or so, you can hear someone basically creeping around in the woods. Every couple of minutes, it comes back into the door and says something. Finally, when the smell fades away, it's around 2 in the morning. Reese says, man, fuck this, and opens the door and walks outside with his rifle. He fires a shot into the air and says something to the effect of, in the name of Jesus Christ, go away, go away. He fires 2 more times, but then, from the woods, right up against the river, across from the trailer, there comes this sound, like a slowly gibbering and hooting sound. Then it starts screaming, and it sounds almost like a woman and a cat in a bag screaming together. Like, I seriously have never heard any shit like that. Reese fires into the tree line, and then starts backing into the house. We lock the door, and we can hear the shit keening and screaming. Reese says something had come out of the bushes, super low to the ground, and crawling towards the cabin. He had shot at it. But pretty much, that was how the rest of the night went. It was literally screaming constantly for the next 2 hours, and we could hear shit moving out into the tree line, but it never came back up to the cabin until everyone had finally fallen asleep. Tan had been sitting in the chair watching the door with his rifle. Nobody else heard or saw this, and he told me 2 days later, after the whole thing was over. He said he had been nodding off after the screaming and noises finally stopped, and he had been almost asleep when he saw someone come out of the bathroom and then lay down in the middle of the floor and go to sleep. He just assumed it was one of us, and he had nodded off. Then he said he kind of realized something was wrong, and while pretending to be sleeping, he counted us. There were 9 people in the cabin. He basically didn't want to try to shoot at the fucking thing in the cabin and have it kill us all then and there, or have Reese wake up and start shooting and then we kill ourselves. So he just stayed awake all night pretending to be asleep. He said sometimes it would stand up and kind of do this weird jittery thing or heave like it was laughing, but then it would lay back down. The story closes pretty weak because from my perspective nothing happened. We woke up and I noticed that Tan was a little jittery and that he was avoiding looking at all of us. But we ate some breakfast, packed up, and started walking to his house. He stayed last in the cabin, and he would lock up and bring me my uncle's keys. to just start walking and he would catch up, which I didn't really want to fucking do. When we got a little bit up the path and when he came running up, basically, we just jogged back to his house. His cousin took us home. There was a window in the bathroom. We were too stupid to lock a screenless window. The window was fucking up when he went in there. Now, as you can imagine, I'm guessing it must have been doing that all night, waiting for us to fall asleep or slip up and then getting in among us. As a matter of fact, it walked with us all the goddamn way back to his house, and then he said it lagged to the back of the group and looked him dead in the eyes before walking back into the woods. In 1987, my family and I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, a nice place, smaller than most cities, but interesting. The people there were kind, at least in the inner city. In the neighborhood where my family had moved, everyone was quiet and kept to themselves. Real quaint if you were the type of person who liked those kind of things. For me, I found it odd. No one talked to my family or bothered to communicate while we were staying there. It was like they were hiding some kind of secret. But I did notice one thing. No one came near the house. At first I thought I understood why. The house wasn't exactly in good shape, if you know what I mean. The walls outside were rusted. The grass outside was tall and filled with bushes, and the place looked like a dump. But after a while, I started to notice things. People on the streets wouldn't come near the house at all. They acted as if it was going to devour them or something. Kids on the street would point and stare, and eventually, after I started school, I learned just why the people there were so afraid of our house. You know that place is haunted. That's the first thing someone said to me as I stepped into school. Not even a single hello or a welcome. No, I got nothing of that. At first I was a bit confused. What's haunted? I said to the kid in front of me, the one who decided to make that statement. He didn't say anything. He just turned around and started walking away. I was a bit curious now. I wonder if what that kid said was true, or if it was just some kind of prank, something to pull on the new kid. But I was very wrong. I now know. School went on for a while, and everything seemed fine. My father and mother were happy. My sister, she was happy as well. But I noticed things started to happen to me. I would wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy feeling on my chest. It was as if something was laying on top of me or pressing against my body. But when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. During those nights I swore I was being watched, as if someone was stalking me. There was this dark corner in my room that would appear every night. It was the only part of my room that was invisible during the nighttime. It was from that corner that I felt something watching me, as if someone was standing there. But I was too afraid to ever go and check. Not to mention, I was always very tired, and I tried to shrug it off and sleep, until one night, that is. As I laid in bed that night, I was having trouble sleeping as usual. That heavy feeling on my chest had returned, and it was getting hard for me to breathe. I had this feeling of overwhelming fear, but I didn't know why. It was like I was fearing for my dear life, without any reason. My eyes were open slightly, and as I gazed around the room, I swore I saw the shadows moving in the moonlight, zooming past my vision, as if they were getting closer and closer. Eventually, the shadows formed into what appeared to be a man, in a dark, long cloak. I then woke up fully. I took a deep breath, and I backed up against the wall behind my bed. But after that, I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed or something. Whatever that thing was, that man was coming closer, It sat down on my bed, and it began to crawl towards me. I saw its dark hands press against my covers. The fingers resembled claws of some sort, but that wasn't its most terrifying feature. It had no face, no eyes. It was just darkness, a living shadow. I was panicking now. It kept coming closer and closer until it was in my face. You know, my parents always told me to pray when I felt scared, that God would answer my prayers and protect me. Well, he must have forgotten about me this time, because no amount of prayer whatsoever seemed to be helping. This thing was in my face. Its hands were reaching out, and just as it touched my face, it spoke in the deepest, darkest voice I had ever heard. I couldn't make out what it said. It was speaking in some kind of odd language, but even if it spoke English, I doubt I would have listened. I was too scared, too shaken up to pay attention. This thing spoke to me for I don't know how long, its dark, shadowy figure looming over me as it trailed its claw-like finger across my cheek, cutting into my skin slightly as some blood leaked down into my shirt. I thought this was it. I really thought I was going to die that night. However, I heard a knock at my door. I was relieved in some ways, but I was still scared that this thing was sitting on top of me, and for all I knew, it was about to eat or kill me or something. After the third knock, my mother walked into the room, and she looked over at me. She couldn't see anything. I guess she acted like I wasn't there, as if I wasn't in my room. Maybe that thing on top of me blocked her view. I really don't know, but all hope was drained from my body at that very moment. I figured this was it. I was done for. But in the blink of an eye, I saw that thing get off me. It walked back to the spot where it first formed, and it began to change. My mother had left the room by now, but I was more focused on what this thing was turning into. For a moment, it looked as if I was staring into a silhouette of myself. The creature, the man, this being, whatever it was, it then waved to me, its still dark and shadowy body fading into a black mist. I didn't stay in that room. I got up, I ran downstairs, and I slept on the couch, with every light on possible. The next morning, I awoke early, before everyone else. I packed some clothes, small food, and some extra cash that my father had left in a jar on top of the fridge. I wrote a small note detailing what happened on the counter in the kitchen. Then I left, and I never looked back. I was 17 at the time, but mentally, I felt much older. I eventually crossed state lines, going back to my home state of Texas, where I got a job as a clerk in some crappy little convenience store on the south side of Dallas. Times were tough, but I pushed through. To be honest, I had been wanting to leave home for a long time. I just needed a reason to do it. In some fucked up way, I guess what happened was that reason. But looking back, I never did hear from my family again. I sent them letters, pictures, but nothing. I never got anything back. I figured they either forgot about me, or they simply just didn't care. It wasn't until recently that I began to research on what happened that night. I had been having odd dreams lately. It seemed that this strange, heavy feeling on my chest had returned. I didn't know why, but I felt that if this thing was coming back for me, I wanted to know what it was. I then visited the local library, but I didn't find much interest. The closest I came to anything was an old Navajo legend called yenaglooshi. Apparently, it was a demonic force, or a person that would assume the shape of animals or people. It seemed logical, but I couldn't understand what such a thing would want with me. I was scared. I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, until someone I hadn't seen in a very long time showed up at my door. My mother. She was happy to see me, but she didn't seem that different since when I last saw her. Now mind you, I hadn't seen her for 25 years. I found it a bit odd that she still looked so young, but I shrugged it off. I was happy to see her. So very happy. We talked for a while, but something was off. Every time she looked at me, I got this cold feeling in my body. I felt as if I was staring at a different person. And after a while, I began to feel weak. I was tired. I hadn't slept for days. So I just went up to my room. Before that, however, my mother was telling me how my father left not long after I did, and that he took my sister with her. It was shocking, but I didn't care so much. I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay down in my bed, that feeling returned. That very same feeling I hadn't felt in 25 years. Someone is watching me from the corner of my room. I'm trying not to pay attention. I'm simply going to turn over and close my eyes. I'm not sure though if I'll make it through this night. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you do, please find my family, inform them of what happened here. The journal of John F. Moncada was found thrown in the corner of his room by police earlier this month. He was laying in his bed, calm and lifeless, when they arrived. After examining his journal, police determined that the man had been up for a week or so before he eventually died from a heart attack. They also suspect that the man was hallucinating before he died, as the woman he claimed to be his mother was never there. In fact, she died 23 years ago in a house fire, along with the rest of his family. Strange, his bedroom window was open when the police arrived, and many neighbors claimed they saw a dark figure emerge a few nights ago. Even though there is little proof other than the witnesses' reports, the mirror in his bathroom, however, the police found many strange symbols carved into the glass, those of which were later translated from the Navajo language. There was one word, and it was burden. Police aren't sure if it holds any relevance to what happened here, but the case is now officially closed.